Everyone, and welcome to A New Direction. My name is Jay Izzo, and oh man, we have a great show. I am telling you, this book, I love this book. This book is called Unlearning Anxiety and Depression, the 4-step self-coaching program to reclaim your life. Dr. Joe Luciani is with us, and oh man, this is such a good book. This is such a great book. You are going to absolutely love it. Here's the deal. Let me just give you the deal on this here, all right? Here's the deal. I know that there are some of you out there who really like your anxiety and depression. The fact of the matter is you enjoy it. Because you know why you enjoy it? Because you like the attention you get from your anxiety and depression. Because you think you're controlling the world. You think that's what you got to do, right? I got to have a little anxiety, a little depression. Got to have the attention, right? Well, listen, you don't have to listen to this show if you want to hold on to your anxiety and depression. Because here's what's going to happen. He's going to fix it. Yeah. So here's the deal, right? So if you want to hold on to your anxiety and depression, then by all means, feel free to leave the show. It's up to you. But if you really do want to have a truly self-coaching, mind talk, habit loop destruction, self-trusting, amazing life, right? If you're ready for that, then you're ready for the show. Because Dr. Joe is going to blow the doors off of you. Dr. Joseph J. Luciani, right? He calls it Luciani, right? It's me and my formal Italian. But do you know he runs 4 New York City marathons, hunts dinosaur bones in Wyoming, practices yoga and meditations? Dr. Joe, I'm going to call him Dr. Joe, right? He lives the life he wants, but it wasn't always that way for him. He's had years of struggle with anxiety, self-doubt that led to a career in psychology, which, by the way, all of us psychological professionals seem to have tried to figure out our own dysfunction with the hope of finding relief. And that relief came with the discovery that anxiety and depression, if treated as habits rather than as mental illnesses, can be dealt with simply and directly without endlessly having to dissect the whys of the past. As with someone trying to quit smoking, you don't have to know why you took the first cigarette, simply need to get rid of it, right? So Dr. Joe's been practicing clinical psychology for more than 35 years, although he looks like he just got out of graduate school. He's the internationally best-selling author of the self-coaching series of books published in 9 languages. He says to me that this is his swan song. I don't believe him. He's written articles, and because you know what, in his book he keeps telling me he's not going to tell me another story, and he keeps telling me another story. So I'm just not going to buy into that. He's written articles and been featured in numerous national magazines and newspapers, including the Oprah Magazine, Red Book, USA Today, Fitness, Health, Shape, and Body and Soul, and he appears frequently on national TV, radio, and the internet. His books are going to be available everywhere bookstores books are sold, and especially on Amazon. So listen, would you please welcome to show everyone Dr. Joe Luciani. And Dr. Joe, welcome to A New Direction.
Jay, thank you. It is my privilege to be here, especially with all that energy you bring to the microphone.
Well, I hand select every book, right? And I probably turn down more books than I actually select. And I choose them because on some level, every book has to excite me because I believe it's going to be exciting for the listener. And we're in 60 countries around the world. And I know that I'm very intentional about these books. And so I am really excited when I get a book that speaks to me, and your book just really spoke to me in a very deep way because, like you, I've had to deal with my own anxiety and depression during the course of my life, and have had to, I've done therapy, I've done all sorts of things, but the truth of the matter is I finally had to tell the voices that were trying to talk me into or out of stuff to shut up and take control of it, right? And that's kind of the premise of the book, isn't it?
That's it. Shut up and take control. Absolutely. But you know what? I want to mention earlier when we first started, I was listening to you, and you said that people that cling to their anxieties and depression. I have often seen maybe a good percentage of people that come into my office as patients that a lot of people don't want to get better. That they really want to become better neurotics. It's like the worry board. They don't want to stop worrying. They want a guarantee. To which I say, buy a toaster.
Yeah, it's true. It really is true. I mean, sometimes we kind of like our own crud.
But there's a superstitiousness to worrying. Like, how many times have I said to someone who's worrying about, well, what would the results of that test be? Or what if I get COVID? Or the what if, what if, what if? And I say, and we talk about ways to stop worrying. And one of the typical responses I get, yeah, but if I stop worrying, something bad's going to happen.
Right.
It's almost as if worrying is an insulation. It's a kind of way to protect yourself from bad things. It's no different from knocking on wood or anything else. But we cling to worrying, which certainly underscores anxiety and depression, as if it's something that really is going to help us as things come around that corner.
We kind of have the superstitious behavior attached to sometimes some of our anxiety or worry, right? Where we go, that whole superstition of, well, if I don't worry about it, then for sure
Yep.
something bad's going to happen. And we get so, it's really odd. Even the most non-superstitious or unsuperstitious, what is it, un or non? Even the most non-superstitious person I know of who will worry will say, but if I don't worry about it, chances are something bad's going to really happen.
Yeah.
And it takes them out, and you talk about it takes them out of the present.
Absolutely. I call it time traveling. The person that worries has left the present, and they are in the future in terms of what will happen tomorrow or whatever. Mark Twain said, I've worried about many things in my life, most of which have never happened.
Mm.
But when we worry, we're worrying about tomorrow. And that is what I call an emotional fiction, because tomorrow doesn't exist in the moment. Yeah, we like to prepare. We have seatbelts. We take vitamins. We do things to protect ourselves, to anticipate. I mean, let's face it, our species wouldn't be here today if we didn't have some anticipatory mechanism. But worry takes anticipation to a point of emotional insecurity, kind of contamination, and that's where it becomes toxic. Then we start, getting into the ruminative doubts, fears, and
Mm.
negativities, and that's where it leads to, of course, the suffering and the struggle of anxiety and depression.
We're talking with Dr. Joseph Luciani. His book is entitled Unlearning Anxiety and Depression, the 4-step self-coaching program to reclaim your life. Absolutely a brilliant book. I'm telling you, please, people, listen. If you're tired of anxiety and depression and you're tired of living with the voices and the things that you think seem to crop out of nowhere, the fact of the matter is this book is just brilliant, and his methodology is absolutely impeccable. And the book can be purchased anywhere, Amazon, bookstores near you. If they don't have it, tell them to get it. Tell them to face it out. It's really that great of a book. I can't be more sincere about that. So let's talk about how we get here to this unlearning process. Because as I'm reading the book, one of the things that struck me was I was reading, I thought, every possible, when the book started, every possible objection to why your methodology wouldn't work. That was kind of how I listened to the book, right? So the first thing you say, right, is like static brain, plastic brain, and you ask the question. And because I can hear somebody sitting in front of you in your office, right, and saying, Doc, my brain cannot be retrained. There is no way that you could tell me that the brain is the brain, Doc. It can't be retrained. What do you say to that?
I almost invariably refer to a study that got me hooked on this thing called neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change. And the study took place in England with the black cab drivers, those black little cabs that go around. In order to become a black cab driver, you have to pass a test where you memorize something like 20,000 addresses and landmarks, and it's about a 2-year process. So these people, the cab drivers, once they passed, they had an MRI of their brains. And this was the initiation of the study. After 2 years of driving, they redid the MRI, and they found that the hippocampus and the navigation center in the brain had grown significantly. But what's really interesting is they compared it to bus drivers who drive the same route every day, no change in the hippocampus. So we see from that and many, many, many experiments that the brain really does change through practice, tenacious learning, and effort. It would be like playing an instrument. Your brain changes as you learn that instrument. So what I try to tell people is that the reason the psychology of neuroplasticity is so important, because if you are a victim of your own anxiety or depression, you're connected to a habit loop that just keeps going on and on. That's where the brain has molded itself. So we need to neutralize that and replace it and learn. We need to learn a new and more productive habit and lifestyle. And that's where the term unlearning came from, because in order to be anxious or depressed, you had to first learn it in order to unlearn it. And I know it's rather heretical to think of anxiety and depression as habits, but that's exactly what I do.
Well, I don't want to say argument. I hate using that word because that just sounds so wrong. But I'm going to say it anyway because I can't think of a better word right now. But the argument that you make and that you set up really does suggest really, really clearly, not just suggest. I mean, because I came from a world of experimental psychology, I don't like using the word prove, but it clearly demonstrates. How about that? It clearly demonstrates that when we put all these pieces together in terms of our brain's plasticity, the fact that learning does in fact change. You talk about the study, I think, was this the Eric Cannell study who won the Nobel Prize for discovering learning actually, what we learn actually changes our brain chemistry or brain structure actually. And that when you start putting all these pieces together, it becomes pretty clear that the fact is we kind of run into these habits because, as you talk about it in the book, it makes us more efficient and our brain loves efficiency. And so now we've got these habits that we've created, bad or good. And so if we've learned something, I love this is so simple, but it's so elegant. If we've learned it, well, then we can unlearn it.
Can you imagine if you had to learn to how to retie your shoe every day, or just even how to button a shirt or a blouse?
Right.
I mean, the things that have become habituated, if we weren't creatures of habit, I would venture to say that we would have been eaten up by a saber tooth a long, long time ago.
Well, you do make it really clear in the book that, our brain is, bent on survival, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're just trying to survive, and whether we want to go old brain, amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus, whether we want to go inside there or, just the fact that our frontal lobe is trying to just process something to keep us surviving. I mean, the fact of the matter is, right? I mean, that's kind of the basic nature of what our brain and body does.
Yeah. Well, in any given situation, it's all about survival on many different levels. Survival in a conversation, survival listening to Jay Izzo, survival. No, I'm just kidding. But
that was well done, by the way. I love that. That's awesome. Good for you.
But basically, what happens is that Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, once said that the ego is this tiny island in this vast ocean of potentiality. And we tend to think of the ego, that consciousness, that frontal lobe capacity, what we think. We tend to think of that as the supreme commander of everything that we are. But there's so much more to us. Just take, for example, if you're driving along in a car and someone hits the brakes, if you had to cognitively ask yourself, should I hit the brake or should I turn the wheel? Bam, you'd be smashed into that car. We have this reflexive kind of, they call it the old limbic system, or the what's the brain called? I can't remember, but something like the lizard brain.
Lizard. Yeah.
So we have these primitive parts of us that react. Cortisol, adrenaline, boom, boom, we react, and it's a non-thinking response, right. And that's what protects us in that given moment: the fight, flight, freeze, and I have a fourth to add to that: fight, flight, freeze, and I say fester, which is where the neurotics lie. We fester and we ruminate and we think about it and then we act. But we have many survival attributes that work in unison, sometimes independently in an emergency situation, and sometimes when we're trying to deal with less than traumatic situations. We are very sophisticated survival machines. It always impresses me.
I want to talk about three things because these three things kind of mold together, and it's psychology, coaching, and neuroplasticity, because the crux of the book is self-coaching, and we've already talked a little bit about neuroplasticity, but I thought this was really interesting. You said psychology is considered a social science, neuroplasticity is considered a biological science, and self-coaching is a simple motivational science. And you're going to try to put these all together. Can you kind of work us through some of that?
Sure. The One of the things that really bothered me when I started as a psychologist was that I had traditional training. In fact, I went to the Jungian Institute and had my 10 years of training analysis. So I was formally trained, and it was wonderful. It's so exciting, the collective unconscious archetypes. It's all that stuff is really wonderful, and I was using that in my practice. And people they loved it. They thought it was wonderful too. But no one was getting better. It's like, okay, yeah, we're having a good time here, but you're paying me for this. So I started to become more eclectic, and I was looking more for a way to interact directly and to get results. To be honest, I was impatient. Maybe it's my ADD personality, but I wanted results. And I did not get any kickback from that. Everyone wanted results, so we had no problem. But the way I went forward was to realize that I had to be me and I had to engage in a legitimate conversation. I needed to inspire depressed people. I needed to motivate them. I needed to keep people in the game. I needed them to leave therapy and go home and do things and practice things and not just rely on me. There's a real cancer involved in being a therapist or a helping professional, in that a dependency invariably develops where people become somewhat infantilized and take less and less responsibility. Well, I have my therapy next Thursday. I'll wait till I go and discuss it with the doc. So I started to rebel against that. And I started to try to find those things that seemed to click and work for me. And those were the three pillars of the unlearning process. So with cognitive behavioral psychology, I knew we had to start reframing the way we think. And I knew that because insecurity distorts our thoughts and perceptions, it was very important to make that clear and to clarify reality or facts from emotional fictions. That choice alone, and if we get into mind talk, I'll be glad to go deeper into that. So the cognitive was a really a definite part or beginning place for me to start. The neuroplasticity came later. I used to tell patients long before I ever heard the word neuroplasticity, you have to treat every thought as if it's this minute chemical change that's going to take place in your brain. Because I felt that if people would just see thoughts not simply as this ethereal emotional thing, but as a really tiny, small bit of chemical energy that you produce, and that energy is either positive or negative, but you're actually putting these small thought chemicals into your brain. Now, it's the cumulative effect. One thought isn't going to change your brain. But over time, the cumulative effect of a lot of toxic thoughts begin to have a toxic formative effect in the brain. And then I got more involved in neuroplasticity and realized that's exactly what happens. We're actually changing the neural pathways in our brain, the habit loops in our brain by the thoughts that we have. So it is the aggregate amount of thoughts, whether they lean positive or negative, that changes us in those directions. And then came the motivational part. And that came was what I call the self-coaching part. That came from trying to help a cousin of mine who had just lost his business, which was a restaurant, his home, which was above the restaurant, and 40,000 K in cash that he had in the wall. And he was really anxious when I got to talk to him. He was on 5 medications. But what it did for me, he wasn't a patient, he was a cousin. And I was able to unleash a lot of confrontational kind of, in your face kind of, you got to do this and blah, 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 blah. It was maybe for me, it was an epiphany to realize that sometimes people really need you as a therapist to really be a coach, a motivator, someone that doesn't accept passivity, someone that doesn't accept, quote unquote, mental illness, someone who says you can do this, and then provide a format for that. So by combining cognitive behavioral psychology with neuroplasticity and motivational self-coaching, that trifecta has worked wonders for me and for my practice over 40 years now.
Well, it was interesting because the piece, by the way, we're talking with Dr. Joseph Luciani, Unlearning Anxiety and Depression, the 4-step self-coaching program to reclaim your life. And we're getting a little bit of background before we get into some of the nuts and bolts of this. One of the things, there was 2 life incidences that I found that you had that I thought were very, very important. I think one, of course, was the cousin. When you finally said, you could almost hear your frustration in the book when you said, you know what? Stop thinking of me as somebody's got all the answers. Think of me as a coach. And I thought that was a huge moment. But then I'll tell you, the other moment that you had is when you went to the psychoanalyst. and right, and you're working on your own stuff, and you go to the psychoanalyst. And I thought this was a big moment because I think it's kind of, in my mind, it seemed like, okay, well, this is why that, the what is more important than the why. Do you want to tell that story?
Sure. Because as you mentioned earlier, because of my own anxiety and struggle, I really felt that a career in psychology would provide answers. And along with that, I said, well, let's get started. And when I was going through just after graduate work, just before graduate work, the gold standard was Freudian analysis. So I found a local Freudian analyst, and I started going to psychoanalysis. He wanted me to go 5 days a week. I could only afford one, and so we negotiated a kind of therapy. He never really talked. So I would sit and pre-associate. What color is the rug? It's yellow. Yes, and it's wonderful. And then one day I had a dream, and in the dream there was a bug on the back of my leg, just behind the knee. And he finally said something. He said, you want to have sex with your mother? And I'm sitting there thinking, finally an opinion, but I knew I had to get out of there. But long story short, I went off to graduate school in California. He did not want me to go. He said, you're not going to be able to handle this. You've got much too much anxiety. I needed to do this. I went. And I went with this noose around my neck. I went with this terrible weight on my shoulders. I'm going to explode. I'm a time bomb. He's my analyst. He knows me better than I know me. Right. So a month goes by, 6 months go by, no explosion.
Right.
I get a letter from him saying his analyst said I needed to write you and apologize for my counter-transference. As I say in the book, I hope I never run into him on the street. It's a Jersey thing.
Right.
But that could have ruined my entire life. I'm so glad that I stuck to my intuition. And I should mention that the one thing I cherish most about me is my intuitive capacity. I'm an impatient person. I like to go from A to Z, but I also have honed those antennae over the years, and that with intuition has really served me quite well.
The reason why that story I think is so critical is and it is your intuition, because your intuition is also all over this book. But I think the reason why that story was so important is because so often when those of us who have dealt with our own anxiety, or who are dealing with anxiety, or dealing with depression, or have dealt with depression, so frequently we want to think that therapy is the golden ticket.
Mm-hmm.
And that somehow that the therapist has some sort of magical answer that's going to solve the problem. And I think the thing to me about your book that spoke volumes and was just shouting at me as I was reading it is, literally when you said, you know what, you need to think of a brick wall. You don't have to examine every single brick on the brick wall to say, oh, that's a brick wall. And you and I think what happens is there's this paralysis by analysis. I know you didn't say that exactly in those terms, and I'm paraphrasing here, but sometimes we get paralyzed by trying to find the why, don't we?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's such a crippling, long-term, lifelong effort, because you can always keep splitting the atom.
The brick
Now we know
wall
we
to
can get
say,
into these
oh,
quarks
that's
and
a
all
brick
these
wall.
subatomic particles, but it's
And
the same with the
and
psyche.
and
I mean, you go back, and this is what I did in that psychoanalysis. I went back, and you go as far back as you can, then you come up a few notches, and what did Uncle Louis say, and how did you react to? So it drives you crazy, but you keep thinking, as you say, that you're going to find this pot of gold. That once you find that, aha, that's why, that it's going to set you free. And I tell people the truth is not going to set you free. The truth is wonderful and it can help amplify what you need to do. But in order to get to a state where you are unlearning anxiety and depression, no book in the world, no therapist in the world is going to do that work for you. And the reason being is because it's like a musical instrument. You could tell me, okay, this is what Mozart sounds like, and you could hum a tune. But that's not going to get me to go home and play Mozart on the piano. I have to tell people that getting away from anxiety and depression is absolutely doable. But there is a but. And the but is you need a format, you need a plan to follow, and this is the crucial part that a lot of people just don't want to hear. And you must practice this every single day. We're talking about breaking habits. You're not, as you said earlier on, you're not going to break any habit, much a cigarette habit or a habit of biting your nails, unless you work at it continually over time. And if you're willing to apply yourself to the practice, and again, you need a format. You can't just practice without knowing what you're doing, but with the insights and the format for doing something about these problems, and with the practice, if you do that, you will find the way towards that clarity.
we're talking to Dr. Joseph Luciani and his book, Unlearning Anxiety and Depression, and we're kind of just getting started here a little bit, and we're kind of working our way to, some of the, I don't know, I don't know if I want to call them complaints. I think it's more of objections that some people have when they hear the word self-coaching, and that I could be self-coached, and that through this, and so often, Dr. Joe, what happens is people will say things like, well, you're expecting me to just get through my own anxiety on my own, or my own depression on my own. You clearly don't have a clue. I mean, I can hear him saying this, right? You clearly do not understand depression if you're telling me that I am not going to get, that I can actually control my own depression. But the truth of the matter is, you set this up to say, look, you can, you know what, you can change your brain. You are what you kind of believe. Let's talk about depression for just a little bit, because it does fall on a continuum. And
Mhm.
you talk about one end is mild, and then, then there's life-altering distress. So are we talking, when we talk depression in terms of this book, what depression, let's talk about what depression are we talking about?
Well, I would say any self-help book is probably more geared towards mild to moderate. With severe depression, I really think that medication is appropriate. I call it a therapy facilitator. The significance in terms of the brain balance, the imbalance is really proportionate from mild to severe. But in terms of a self-help program, I would say mild to moderate. A book like mine can be very useful for someone with severe depression, along with their therapist or psychiatrist. It's really a matter of putting everything into this. So if you need medication, please stay on your medication, but realize that by learning what the motor is, by learning what generates, it's like any habit. You're either feeding it or you're starving it. And if you don't know what you're doing that's feeding your depression, then of course the medication is holding you there. It's keeping that balance for you. If you think of a bucket with your vital neurotransmitters in there, dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and we poke holes in the bottom of that bucket through insecurity and distorted thinking, well, those chemicals are going to drip out. Too many holes, the faster it drips out. So your natural balance, your body, your homeostatic processes cannot be maintained, and the mind becomes imbalanced chemically. That is what happens chemically with anxiety and depression. You create imbalances. The more severe the imbalance, the more distress one feels. So what self-coaching does, or what I try to do through coaching people through this program, is to get them to plug up those holes. What feeds, what starves. Once you know what you're doing that is actually exacerbating and feeding your problems, then you begin the process of plugging up those holes, in which case the homeostatic process, the natural balancing process of the body, is able to restore your natural resilience without the medication. Now, I can't say that for every person, unlearning anxiety and depression is going to get you off medication. But I do feel very sincerely that by once you learn to stop feeding the depression, at the very least, you should be able to minimize, if not eventually come off the medication.
Dr. Joe, we're running into the third stretch of the of the show here, and you kind of beat me to the punch on some of these things, and I'm glad that you did, because that just shuts me up. I just kind of let you go, when you do stuff like that. But you really did, because I was going to have you talk about some of the depression, and I was going to have to talk about some of the medication, and that medication can be important. But the one thing I really want to focus on, and there seems to be a common theme between depression and anxiety, and we haven't given it really we've kind of talked about it, but we haven't really focused in on it. And that is the importance of our insecurities when it comes to these two areas of depression and anxiety. And let's talk about insecurity and why it's such a powerful force when it comes to depression and anxiety.
Okay, well, first we understand that, or at least in my experience, I've never met someone without some insecurity. And the reason being is that no one grows up in a perfect world. No one has perfect parents. Everyone has had illness, separation, loss. So there is some degree of early insecurity that's inculcated into our experience. Um, that another word for insecurity is a feeling of vulnerability. So because we feel insecure and vulnerable, and since, as we were talking earlier, we are survival machines, then the first thing we do is we want to compensate for our vulnerabilities. So how do we compensate? Well, we compensate a vulnerability by trying to control some aspect of life. If I'm vulnerable, how do I plug up the gaps and feel less vulnerable? Well, we were talking about worrying. Worrying is the quintessential coping kind of strategy, controlling strategy. We worry because we're trying to anticipate. We want to know what's coming before it happens. We want to be braced. We want to be ready. We don't want to be vulnerable. Avoidance, compulsivity. There's lots of coping and controlling strategies. I call it a control juggle. And these are all born out of insecurity and feelings of vulnerability. So it starts with insecurity. We compensate insecurity and vulnerability by developing a control juggle, which is very personal. Some people will be worrywarts. Other people will hunker down and be socially awkward or even adverse. There are many ways that we become controlling, or our controlling juggle becomes part of our personality. So that's fine. And we go through life controlling. It's not as easy as just flowing through life without a controlling juggle, but nevertheless, we try to control life because we're feeling insecure. But what happens over time is that the controlling juggle, think of a juggler, and we're juggling these balls of control, worrying, avoidance, compulsivity, that eventually lactic acid, mental lactic acid builds up. And what happens to a real juggler? Well, you would drop those balls. So when the control juggle begins to falter, that's when we start feeling out of control. That's when we start feeling most vulnerable. And that's usually when the onset of anxiety and depression kicks in. So both anxiety and depression are the result of the control juggle, controlling life, I should say over controlling life, begins to falter. and we're starting to feel more vulnerable. Anxiety, of course, because now we're revving up the engine. Well, what am I going to do? I've got to do something. And depression as a retreat from life to insulate ourselves from that loss of control. So my book is all about understanding the basis of insecurity being the foundational element in our struggle, and then realizing that it is not to try to be more controlling of life, but to start learning to, as we'll say, self-trust enough to handle life as it occurs naturally and fluidly. So that's the essence of the insecurity basis of my book.
Well, I think here's the thing. There's two things that I think that come up when we talk about insecurity. First of all, our childhood does play a part in that
Mm-hmm.
insecurity. I mean, because you're absolutely right. Nobody can say. And sometimes we're in such denial, right? And denial, by the way, is my acronym for "Don't even know I am lying." Okay, that. And by the way, I owe my wife for that because she gave me that. But
Love it.
because she tells me I'm in denial quite a bit. Okay, anyway, that's another story. But the truth of the matter is, though, that you know we often think that our childhoods were, oh, my parents weren't bad. They weren't bad to me, and they may not have been bad to you. And you talk about this in the book too. It's not that necessarily that your parents were bad, but you say something to the effect, but you may have not received the love that you needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there are many loving parents who take, for example, a controlling mother, an over controlling mother or father. Um, to the child, that feels like love. Don't do that. Don't touch that. You'll get
Right,
hurt.
right,
That feels like love because that parent is saying to that child, oh, you just need to be protected. Let me protect you.
right.
So that now adult might look back and say, "Of course, my parents loved me. They were so caring and they were
Right.
so concerned." Meanwhile, that over controlling, what does it do to the child's psyche? Well, it says this world must be a really dangerous place because you've got to be so vigilant or you're going to get gobbled up. So you see, these things do affect us. There are defective parenting techniques, of course. There's abusive parenting. There's the indifferent parent who really can't love. There are many different types of defective parenting. But for the person who says, "Oh, I had this wonderful childhood. It was just without any problems," but they're sitting in the office with anxiety or depression, which leads me to say, well, maybe denial is part of this, and it may not be a conscious denial, of course, because you come to accept that this is the way it was, this was normal, and we tend to then just see this is who I am, and this is what I am.
One of the things that you talk about is the inner and outer, I guess, our inner and outer responses, the inner and outer faces, I'm sorry, of anxiety and depression, right? You talk that we have an inner expression and then we have an outer expression, and then you go through several of these. But the truth of the matter is, regardless, is it our inner expression? Let me rephrase that. Is it our inner expression that shows up outer, or are they separate entities? Do they come together?
Yeah, that's an important point. It all begins, I think, with the inner. I think that the insecurity sets us up to develop those coping strategies, the controlling strategies. And then from there, we tend to manifest that same intentionality to want to control or over control life through kind of a compulsive behavior. So then our behaviors tend to complement the inner need for over controlling
Hmm.
life, and all at the expense of our natural kind of healthy psyche, and all born out of insecurity. So yes, the interface is certainly that which is the worrisome, contemplative insecurity. The outer face would be that compulsive reaction to that tries to now bring that forward in an obsessive way into the world.
By the way, we're talking with Dr. Joseph Luciani and his book Unlearning Anxiety and Depression. And the reason I stumbled over that is because I'm about to bring up a subject matter that is one of those subject matters a lot of people don't want to talk about. And I think it's fun. I think it's a fun topic. And that is chapter 10, I love the title. Say hello to your unconscious, right? This is a hard one, right? Because a lot of people because we don't know what to do with the unconscious. I mean, I think most people think it exists. I think there's some people who want to deny the existence of the unconscious, which I don't really care whether you want. The fact of the matter is, it's a hard thing to explain, but it is an important messenger, as you point out. So let's just kind of, talk about that. It does play a role in how we're about to gear up for mind talk.
Unconscious, by its very definition, is unknowable since it is unconscious. This is the kind of the groundwater that is just running through our psychological existence. And it does affect us. I mean, anyone that's ever had a dream realizes, well, where does that come from? And certainly you didn't intend certain things to happen in that dream. They are more or less reflections of that unconscious world. Now, the unconscious is really part of that insecurity domain, and is very much affected by that, as other parts of the unconscious is by healthy things. But the unconscious, in a negative sense, from the insecurity sense, will affect us indirectly. So our thoughts, we may not know why we're having this terrible kind of dark thought about our neighbor. And where did that come from? Well, it percolated up from the unconscious. And now in consciousness, it seems somewhat alien to you because it wasn't something that you felt consciously. It wasn't something it was something you may have even been shocked by. But nevertheless, we have to reconcile ourselves with the fact that as long as we are living in opposition to our true nature, if we're allowing insecurity to shape and define us, then usually the unconscious and the conscious will not be in harmony. So the more we start to become more synchronized with ourselves, the more we start to be a more complete person and kind of shed the shackles of insecurity, the more that there is a harmony between the unconscious and the conscious, and the less we're contaminated by those thoughts that come up and really disrupt our normal flow day to day.
That's awesome. Listen, even in grad school, I never got that. That was absolutely awesome right there. Do you realize that we've been on for almost an hour talking about this? This has been awesome. I've had a blast with you.
It's a shame that it has to end. I've also had a blast. Go on another 2 hours.
I could be talking about this forever with you. And you know what? I'm going to ask you if you would come back and we could talk more about this.
Oh, in a heartbeat. I loved it. Great interview. Very, 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 very helpful to be able to articulate with someone like yourself.
Thank you so much. Will you do me kind of a 1 minute why mind talk, right, which is our self-coaching. Give me just a 1 minute brief why mind talk is so powerful and beneficial. Can you do that?
Sure. The most important thing is to realize that, I call it active brain, passive brain, or active mind, passive mind. When we are ruled by insecurity, when we are neurotically driven, when we are worried and just distressed, and we cannot take the reins and steer our lives in any formative direction, that is because we have become passive mind. We are in the back seat, insecurity in the front seat. It's steering us through our thoughts. And we sit back and look at those thoughts as if they are sacrosanct. We don't realize that we are not our thoughts. Those thoughts are the habituated patterns of insecurity. Our conscious mind, active mind, can now say, wait a second, give me that steering wheel. And we differentiate between facts and insecurity-driven fictions. We begin to put a stop to it, and we actively begin to use the awesome power of consciousness, which is more powerful than the unconscious, than the less than conscious. It is the most powerful weapon we have. If we focus like a laser beam, that laser of consciousness onto any effort, it will prevail.
His name is Dr. Joseph Luciani. And the book is called Unlearning Anxiety and Depression. It is the 4-step self-coaching program to reclaim your life. It is brilliant. It is fantastic. Buy it. Buy it not just for yourself. Buy it for a friend. Seriously, I cannot be more sincere than to say, would you get this book for somebody that you know and love?
And
Please.
for any neurotic person, get 2 books in case you lose one.
That's fantastic. Folks, you know what? That's the show. You know what I say every week, right? Be inspired, because when you're inspired, that means you'll inspire other people. And that means when they're inspired, they in turn can inspire others. That can make this world just a simply great place. I'm going to be back with another great guest, another great book, and it's going to be another great show. And as I say to you every week, you know what it is. Ciao, everybody.